Nobody told the children what the platform meant. That was the cruelty of it. They stood in a line under the meeting hall lamps, scrubbed and buttoned into borrowed clothes, and they thought they were being looked at, not weighed. One by one, the good people of Cutter's Bend came forward and chose. A boy with strong hands. A pair of brothers who could be split into two farms. A girl old enough to mind a stove. And then there was the last one. The smallest. The one nobody's eyes would settle on for longer than a breath, because to look at her too long was to feel something you'd have to carry home. I've seen men die on the trail, and I've seen a barn full of horses burn, and I'm telling you now, the quietest, most terrible thing I ever witnessed was a room full of decent folks deciding, without a single word spoken aloud, that a child was worth nothing. They were wrong. It took a stranger walking out of the mountains to prove it. But before you get comfortable thinking you know how this ends, you don't. I was there. I thought I knew too. Stay with me. This one's going to cost you a little something before it's done. The stove in the meeting hall had gone sullen, the way stoves do when a room is too full of people and not enough of them are willing to be the one to feed the fire. So I fed it. That's a thing about me. I can't sit in a cold room and do nothing, same as I can't leave a gate half-latched or a sum half-added. I keep a pencil stub behind my ear and a ledger in my coat, and when I'm nervous I count. Nails, fence posts, the buttons on a stranger's vest. It's a foolish habit for a grown man of 51, but a man my age has earned the right to a few foolish things, and counting is cheaper than whiskey and doesn't leave you stupid in the morning. I counted the children first, 9 of them. They'd come in on the Thursday freight, riding in the back of Pruett's wagon under a canvas that smelled of coal and rain, brought west by a thin woman from a society back east whose whole life seemed to be the moving of unwanted children from where they weren't wanted to where they might be. Miss Agar, her name was. She had the flat, careful voice of a person who has learned not to hope out loud. She'd lined the 9 of them up on the low platform we used for the Christmas pageant and the occasional funeral, and she'd said her piece about Christian charity and honest work and how each child came with papers and a Bible, and then she'd step back and let the town do its choosing. I'd only come to buy nails and to see about a bull calf deacons owed me, and I'd wandered into the hall because there was coffee, and because my wife has been gone 4 years now, and the ranch gets loud with quiet in the evenings. I hadn't meant to watch. Some things, once you start watching, won't let you look away. They went fast, the first few. That surprised me. I'd figured folks would dither. But a strong boy of 12 or 13, Ansel, his papers said, went to the Kellerman place inside of 5 minutes because Kellerman had lost a son to the fever 2 winters back and needed hands and maybe needed something else he'd never say. The 2 brothers, freckled and holding onto each other's sleeves, went to a rancher out past the fork who allowed as how he could use 2 if they came cheap in the feeding. A girl of 10, sturdy, went to the widow pace. A boy who wouldn't stop crying went, surprisingly, to the McReady's, and the crying stopped the moment Mrs. McReady knelt down to his height and licked her thumb and wiped his face like he was already hers, and I had to look at my boots for a spell after that. I want to tell you it was a beautiful thing. Parts of it were. I saw a man's whole face change when a small hand slipped into his. I saw a lonely woman get handed a reason to bake again. There is a version of that evening you could tell as pure kindness and not be lying. But there was the other thing running underneath it, cold and constant as a creek under ice, and the other thing was this: they were choosing. And choosing means passing over. Every child taken was a small miracle, and every child not yet taken stood there watching the pool of the unchosen shrink around them, doing the terrible arithmetic that even a 5-year-old can do. Him, not me. Her, not me. That one, not me. By the time the lamps needed trimming, there were 2 left. Then there was one. The last boy went to a homesteader who I happened to know beat his mules, and I opened my mouth to say something and shut it again, because who was I? And because the alternative to a hard home is sometimes no home at all, and a man learns that arithmetic too, and it doesn't get easier. Miss Agar watched the boy go with her flat, careful face and wrote something in her book, and I found I'd taken my pencil out and was gripping it hard enough to feel the grain of it. And then it was just her. The last one left. She was small. I'd put her at 6, maybe 7, though hunger makes a child's age hard to read. It hollows them out and makes them both younger and older than they are, babyish in the round of the cheek and ancient in the eye. She had brown hair that someone had tried to plait and given up on, so half of it was braided and half hung loose, and she wore a gray dress 2 sizes too big cinched with a length of twine. Her shoes were a boy's shoes, cracked across the toe. And she held in both hands, pressed against her stomach like it was the only warm thing in the world, a small tin box about the size of a deck of cards. She did not cry. That was the part that undid me later when I let myself think on it. All evening I'd braced for her to cry because a crying child pulls at you. A crying child gives you something to respond to. She didn't. She stood very straight with her chin up and her jaw set, and she looked out at the thinning crowd with an expression I have only ever seen on 2 other faces in my life. On a soldier I knew who'd been told his whole company was gone, and on a mare of mine standing over a foal that wouldn't rise. It is the face of something that has decided not to let you see it break, because breaking in front of you would be one more thing taken, and it has decided you will not take that too. The crowd was leaving. That's how these things end, not with a decision but with a slow draining away, folks pulling on coats and gathering children and saying their good nights, and the unchosen simply becomes a problem for tomorrow. Miss Agar stepped up beside the girl and put a hand on her shoulder, and I saw the girl flinch, not away from the hand but into stillness, the way a rabbit goes still. Miss Agar said something low. The girl nodded once. I heard Deacons beside me make a small sound in his throat. "Shame," he said, "little bit of a thing." And then he said the thing that people say, the thing that lets them walk out the door. "Somebody'll take her, down the line. There's always somebody. There's always somebody." I have hated that sentence ever since. It's the sentence people use to hand their own conscience to a stranger who never agreed to hold it. I put my pencil back behind my ear. I told myself the same thing Deacons told himself. I'm a widower with a cattle ranch and a bad knee, and no more idea how to raise a girl child than I do how to sew a wedding dress. I told myself I'd already interfered enough for one evening just by watching. I told myself all the true and reasonable things, and every one of them was a small door I was closing, quietly, one after another, the way you close doors in a house where somebody's sleeping. I was 3 steps toward my own coat when the hall doors opened. They opened the way weather opens a door, all at once, with the night coming in behind. Cold air rolled down the center aisle and made the lamps gutter and the flames lie down flat, and everyone still in the hall turned, because you turn toward cold the way you turn toward a shout. A man stood in the doorway. I say a man. My first thought, God's honest truth, was bare because he filled the frame of it, shoulder to shoulder and near enough to duck the lintel, and he wore a long coat of some dark hide that shed water in a slow shine, and above the collar of it his face was all weather and beard, a gray-shot beard grown wild, a nose broke and healed crooked, eyes set deep under a heavy brow. There was snow melting in his beard. He'd come down out of high country then, where it was already snowing, while down here in the valley it was only the mean cold rain of late October. Nobody in Cutter's Bend spoke, and I understood, in the way you understand a thing all at once without being told, that they knew him, not personally, but they knew of him the way a valley knows the shape of the mountain that shadows it. It was Deacons who breathed the name, and he breathed it low, the way you'd say a word you weren't sure was safe to say out loud. "That's Cade." I didn't know the name. I was 3 years in the valley then, come west to outrun a grief that had followed me anyway, and there were still whole legends of the place I hadn't been handed yet. But I saw what the name did to the room. I saw Kellerman's wife draw her new boy against her skirts. I saw 2 men who'd been laughing a moment before go quiet and find things to do with their hands. And I saw Miss Agar, the thin, careful woman who moved unwanted children across a continent and had surely seen every kind of person the frontier could grow. I saw her straighten and set her flat voice to its flattest, and I understood that even she was recalibrating. The man came down the aisle. He walked with a limp he was trying to hide, favoring the left, and he left wet dark prints on the plank floor, and he did not look at a single soul in that room. He looked at the platform. He looked at the last one left. And she looked at him. Here is the thing I've turned over more times than I can count in the years since. The thing I set down in my ledger that very night in my cramped bad hand because I was afraid I'd start to disbelieve it. The child was not afraid of him. Every grown adult in that hall had gone careful and cold at the sight of this mountain of a man come out of the dark, and the 6-year-old orphan they'd all just declined to want. She looked at him steady, chin up, jaw set, and she did not flinch. She held her little tin box against her belly, and she watched him come the way you'd watch whether you'd already decided to walk out into. He stopped at the foot of the platform. Even standing below her, he was near enough to eye level with her. That's how big he was and how small she was. For a long moment neither of them said anything, and the whole town held its breath, and I found I'd taken my pencil out again and was holding it like a man holds a railing on a boat. When he spoke, his voice was not what the size of him promised. It was low and it was rough, a voice that didn't get used much, a hinge that needed oil. But it was quiet. He pitched it for her and no one else, and the only reason I heard it was that the whole room had gone so silent you could hear the stove tick. "They pass over you," he said. The girl didn't answer right away. She was reading him. I could see her doing it, the same read I'd watched her do on the whole crowd all evening, the fast, terrible calculation of a child who has learned that adults are terrain to be crossed carefully. Then she gave a single small nod. "All of them," he said. Another nod. The man was quiet a moment. Then he did something that made the whole room flinch worse than his arrival had. He reached up slow, one enormous scarred hand, and he took off his hat. He held it against his chest. And a mountain of a man that a whole valley was afraid of stood bareheaded in front of a 6-year-old girl in a boy's cracked shoes, and he said, "Then they're all fools, and I'm sorry you had to stand up here and learn it in front of the whole county. That's a hard thing. That's a thing that oughtn't be done to anybody." I have heard a great many words spoken in my life, sermons and eulogies and wedding vows and the last things dying men choose to say. I don't know that I've ever heard anything land the way those words landed in that hall, because he didn't say it to be heard. That's the whole of it. He said it low and only for her, and yet somehow every last one of us heard it, and every last one of us understood that the fools he meant were us. He'd walked into a room where 50 people had just, without a word, agreed a child was worth nothing, and in 3 sentences he'd made every one of us feel the exact weight of what we'd done. Miss Agar recovered first. It was her business to recover first. She came forward with her book in her flat voice and she said, "Sir, if you're inquiring about placement, there are papers and there is a process, and I want to know your circumstances and your—" "I know how it works," the man said. He didn't look at her, he was still looking at the girl. "I've done it once before." Something moved through the room at that. A whisper, a shifting. Deacons beside me went very still. "What's your name?" the man asked the girl. And the girl, who had not spoken one single word the whole long evening, who had stood there and been passed over 9, 10, a dozen times and never made a sound, the girl opened her mouth, and in a voice like a struck match, small and sudden and gone, she said one word. "Nell." The man nodded slow, like the name confirmed something. Then his eyes went for the first time to the tin box she held against her belly, and I watched his weathered face do something complicated, something that started as curiosity and became recognition and ended, for just a flicker before he mastered it, as grief. Naked grief, the kind you don't recover from, the kind you only build a life on top of and hope it holds. "That box," he said, quiet. "Where'd you get that box, Nell?" The girl's grip tightened on it. Her chin came up another degree. "It's mine," she said. "It's mine. You can't have it." "No," the man said. "No, I don't want it. I'd never take it off you." He knelt then, and it cost him. I could see the bad leg protest. I saw him brace a hand on the platform edge. He knelt down so that this time she was above him, looking down, and he asked her again, gentle as I've ever heard a big man be, "But will you tell me, where'd it come from?" And Nell, small Nell, last Nell, Nell in her boy's cracked shoes with her half-done braid, looked down at the box in her hands and looked at the huge kneeling stranger, and made a decision I don't think anyone in that room understood the size of. She held the tin box out, just a few inches, just enough, and she turned it so he could see the lid. I was too far to see what was scratched or painted there, but I saw his face when he saw it. I saw a man who a whole valley feared come apart, silently, completely, on his knees on the floor of a meeting hall, in front of everyone. And I heard him say, in that old hinge voice broken now clean through, "I gave that box to a woman, a long time ago. I gave that exact box to a woman named—" He didn't finish the name, not in front of the whole town. He stood up instead, that slow braced rise, the bad leg, the hand on the platform, and he put his hat back on, and whatever had come apart in his face, he gathered back up and put away where he kept such things. And when he turned to Miss Agar, his voice was flat and businesslike as her own. "I'll take her," he said. "Tonight, what do you need from me?" But it wasn't tonight, and it wasn't simple, and anyone who's dealt with the machinery of respectable charity could have told him so. Miss Agar had a book and a process, and the process did not bend for mountain men who wept over tin boxes. There were questions. There was a woman from the town's own committee, a Mrs. Thorne, who ran the placing out on the local end and who had opinions about who was fit. And Mrs. Thorne looked at Elias Cade the way you'd look at a wolf that had wandered into the schoolyard, not without a kind of awe, but with her mind already made up that the door needed shutting. "Mr. Cade," she said, "your reputation is not a secret in this valley." "No, ma'am," he agreed, "it is not. They say you live alone up Copper Hollow, no woman in the house, no neighbors within a half-day's ride." "That's true. They say," and here Mrs. Thorne lowered her voice to the register people use for the thing they've been building toward, "that you had a family once, and that you lost them, and that you have not been right since." I watched the man take that. He took it the way a post takes a maul, without moving, absorbing it down into the ground of himself. Beside me, Deakins muttered, "That's the cruelty." And for once in his life Deakins was correct, because it was the cruelty, to say a man's worst grief out loud in a public hall as an argument for why he couldn't be trusted with a child. But here is where I stopped being a man who watches. I don't fully know why I did it. I've told myself a dozen reasons over the years, and none of them is the whole truth. Maybe it was the girl's face, that chin held up all evening. Maybe it was the box, and the way he'd come apart over it, because a man who can still be broken open by an old grief is not a man who's gone hollow inside, whatever they say. Maybe it was just that I'd spent the entire evening closing doors quietly in myself, and I'd reached the last one, and I found I couldn't close it. I heard my own voice before I decided to use it. "I'll vouch for him." The whole hall turned. I am not a man people turn toward as a rule. I'm the fellow at the back feeding the stove and counting the buttons. But I stepped forward with my ledger in my hand like it was a Bible, and I said it again louder, so my voice wouldn't shake. "Amos Kettle. I run the Kettle place out on the North Fork. 3 years now, and any man here'll tell you I pay my debts and mind my fences." Deakins, God bless him, said that's so from behind me. I don't know Mr. Cade from Adam, but I watched what the rest of us did to that child tonight, all of us, myself worst of any, because I stood here the whole evening and did nothing. And then I watched a stranger walk in out of the snow and be the only soul in this room to tell her she had worth. Now you can argue about a man's grief all you like. But I've buried a wife, Mrs. Thorne, and I'll tell you what grief is. Grief is just love that's got no place left to go. And I am looking at a man with a powerful lot of love and no place to put it, and a child with the same, and I do not understand how it is Christian to keep them apart on account of a rumor. It was the longest speech I'd made since my wife's funeral. My hands were shaking when I finished, so I did what I do. I opened my ledger and I pretended to check a figure, and I counted the lines on the page until my heart came back down. It wasn't my speech that did it. I want to be honest. I'd like to tell you my words carried the day, but they didn't. What did it was Nell. While Mrs. Thorne and Miss Agar and I were arguing over her like she was a bull calf at auction, Nell had climbed down off the platform. Nobody'd noticed. And she'd crossed the floor on her cracked shoes, and she'd walked up to the mountain of a man who a whole valley feared, and she'd taken hold of 2 fingers of his enormous scarred hand with her whole small fist. And she stood there, holding on, chin up. You cannot argue with that. There is no process, no book, no committee on earth that can stand against a child who has chosen, out of a whole room of the fearful, the one person who knelt down and told her she mattered. Mrs. Thorne looked at the 2 of them a long moment. Then she looked at me. Then she said, in a voice that had lost all its committee flatness, "You'll ride out and check on them, regular, and you'll report to me true." "Every week," I said, "through the winter and past it." And that is how I came to know the rest of the story, which I'd have never known otherwise, because it happened up Copper Hollow where nobody goes, and it happened slow, over a winter, in the way that real things happen, not in one night in a meeting hall, but in the 10,000 small mornings after. I rode up the first time in November, through snow already knee-deep on the horses, and I found the house better than the rumors had it. A big timber and stone place he'd built with his own hands, warm, tight against the weather. He was a wealthy man, Cade, though you'd never have read it off him. Silver, it turned out. He'd found silver up a played-out claim everyone else had walked away from, back when he was young and had a family to find it for. And by the time the silver came in, the family was gone, and the money meant nothing. And he'd let the valley believe whatever it wanted to believe about the hermit up the hollow, rather than explain a grief he had no words for. The box told the rest, in pieces over that winter, some from him and some I worked out for myself. Years back, before Cutter's Bend was even a town worth the name, Cade had had a wife and a daughter. The daughter had been small and dark-haired, and she'd had a tin box he bought her from a peddler and scratched her initials into with his knife, and she kept her treasures in it, the way children do, feathers and pebbles and one blue glass bead. And there'd been a sickness, the kind that came through in those years and took whole families in a week, and it had taken his wife, and it had taken, he thought, his daughter. He'd buried a wife, but the daughter's body he'd never found, because in the chaos of that dying time, a neighbor woman fleeing the sickness had taken the child east on a wagon, meaning to save her, and had died herself on the road, and the child had passed from hand to hand down the years the way children do when nobody's left to want them, until she washed up in a placing out society back east with no name anyone trusted, and no history, and one possession she'd never once let go of. A tin box, scratched with initials, holding one blue glass bead. Now, I'm a plain man, and I know a story is a story, and the frontier grows tall tailies the way it grows sagebrush. When Cade first pieced it together for me, hoarse, over coffee, I confess a part of me thought, it's what he needs to believe. A grieving man will build a bridge out of any 2 boards that lie near enough together. Maybe the box was a coincidence. Maybe he wanted a daughter back so bad he'd made this small stranger into the ghost of his own. I thought that for a while. I don't think it anymore, and I'll tell you why, but first I have to tell you the hard part, because there was a hard part, and your rules ask for the heavy decision, and this is it. In February, a man came up the hollow. I was there when he came, by luck or by God's design. I'd ridden up with flour and news. He came on a spent horse, a lawyer's kind of man, soft-handed with papers in an oilcloth. And the papers said that Nell was not Nell at all, or not only Nell, that a family back east, a family of some means, had been searching for a lost girl child, a relative's child, an heiress in a small way to a small fortune, and that their inquiries had traced a certain tin box and a certain history to a placing out society, and from there to a valley in the mountains, and from there to a hermit's house up Copper Hollow. And the papers said this family had the law behind them and a claim of blood, and they had come to take the child home, to her proper people, to a life of schools and warm houses, and a name that meant something. And here is the terrible arithmetic. The one Cade had to do at his own kitchen table, with the lawyer watching and me watching and Nell asleep in the next room. The family back east was almost certainly telling the truth. Their claim of blood was real, and their claim was not the same as Cade's claim, because if Nell was truly the granddaughter or the niece these eastern people said, then she was not Cade's lost daughter. The tin box could not belong to two dead children. Either she was his, and these people were mistaken and grasping, or she was theirs, and the box's initials were a coincidence. A grieving man had built a bridge across, and Cade had spent a whole tender winter loving a child who was somebody else's ghost. The lawyer laid it out plain and cold and probably true, and he offered Cade money, a great deal of money, to sign the child over quiet, no fuss, and let her go to the life that was, by any honest measure, better than anything a scarred silver hermit could give her up a snowbound hollow. Schools, society, a future, everything a man who loved a child ought to want for her, even at the cost of everything he wanted for himself. I watched Elias Cade sit with that. I watched him look at the money and look at the door behind which the child slept and look at the tin box which he'd set on the table between them all. He didn't rage. I'd half expected the wolf the valley feared, but there was no wolf in him that night. There was only a man doing the hardest sum of his life, and doing it out loud in that oiled hinge voice, mostly to himself. "If she's mine," he said slowly, "then keeping her is right, and letting her go is a second death I don't survive." He turned the box a quarter turn on the table. "But if she's theirs, if I've dreamed the whole thing because I'm an old fool who wanted his girl back so bad he made a stranger into her, then keeping her is robbery. Then I'm stealing a child from a good life to warm my own cold house. And I'll have done to her the exact thing this whole valley did to her that night in the hall. Wanted her for what she could give me, not for her own self." He was quiet a long time. The fire ticked. The lawyer, to his credit, let him have his silence. "I don't get to know," Cade said finally, and his voice broke on it. "That's the hell of it. I will never get to know for certain if she's my blood or a stranger I love like she is. There's no paper, no witness, no way. There's only a tin box and a man's want, and want is the least trustworthy thing God ever put in a person." He looked up at the lawyer. "So I can't decide it on is she mine. I'll never settle that. I have to decide it on the only thing I can settle." And he looked then toward the door where she slept, on what's best for her. And I thought, God forgive me, I thought, he's going to sign. I thought he was talking himself into the noble thing, the sacrifice, giving her up to the better life because he loved her too well to keep her. And I braced to watch a man cut his own heart out at his kitchen table for the good of a child. That's not what happened. Cade stood up. He crossed to the door and opened it soft and stood looking in at her a while. And then he came back, and he did not pick up the pen. "Ask her," he said. The lawyer blinked. "She's a child, she can't." "She stood on a platform," Cade said, "in front of a whole county, and every soul there passed her over, and she never once cried. She's crossed half this country in the backs of strangers' wagons. She chose me out of a room full of frightened people because I was the one that knelt down. Don't you tell me that child can't decide what's best for her. She's decided more and harder and younger than you or I ever have." He set his big scarred hand flat on the table. "You've got a fine house and a fine name and a fine future to offer her, and it may well be better than mine, and I won't stand in the door and stop her taking it. But you'll ask her. In the morning, rested and fed and warm. You'll lay it out honest, the schools, the name, the whole of it, and you'll ask her what she wants. And whatever she says, I'll abide, even if it's the thing that kills me." They asked her in the morning. I was there. The lawyer laid it out gentle, more gentle than I'd have credited him, all of it. the family that wanted her, the warm Eastern house, the schools, the pretty dresses, a life. And Nell listened, chin up, the way she listened to everything, doing her fast, terrible arithmetic. And when he was done, she was quiet a while, and my heart was going like a hammer, and I saw Cade standing by the window with his back half turned like a man who cannot watch the thing he cannot look away from. Then Nell got up off her chair. She crossed the room on her cracked shoes. She'd have new ones by then. Cade had bought her new ones in December, but I always see her in the cracked ones. That's how she lives in my memory. She walked past the lawyer, past the papers, past the money. She went to the window, and she took hold of 2 fingers of Elias Cade's enormous scarred hand with her whole small fist, the exact same as she'd done that first night in the hall. And she said, to the lawyer, but looking up at Cade, she said, "He was the only one who wanted me before he knew I was worth anything." That was all. That was the whole of it. Before he knew I was worth anything. A child of 6 or 7, and she'd seen it clean to the bone, that the Eastern family wanted her for her name and her blood and her small fortune, wanted the heiress, and that the man by the window had wanted her when she was nothing, the last one left, worth nothing, holding a tin box in a cold hall while a whole valley looked away. The lawyer rode back down the hollow alone. I never did learn the truth of it, whether she was his blood or a stranger's. Cade never chased it, said the not knowing was his to carry and he'd carry it, that a man doesn't get to have everything settled and maybe it's better so. The Eastern family made noise for a while and then didn't. There was a cousin, I heard later, glad enough to be the heir once the lost girl stayed lost to them. I rode up that hollow every week that winter like I'd promised, and then I kept riding up long after Mrs. Thorne stopped needing my reports, because a strange thing had happened, which is that I'd gone up to check on a child and found a family, and a man alone gets hungry for the sight of one. I taught her sums. She was quicker at them than I am. She'd have the answer while I was still counting on the page, and she'd laugh at me for my counting, the button counting, the fence post counting, and Cade would almost smile behind his gray beard. And the house that a valley thought was haunted got loud with the particular noise that only a child makes, which is the opposite of the quiet noise an empty house makes, and I'd know both, and I could tell you the difference blindfolded. She kept the tin box on the shelf by her bed. One blue glass bead inside it, and, come spring, a hawk's feather she found, and a river stone, and a button I gave her off my own coat, because I'd caught the counting habit going the other direction by then and had one to spare. I wrote all this down that first night in my ledger, the meeting hall and the snow in his beard and the chin she held up, because I was afraid I'd start to disbelieve it. I read it back sometimes. I'm an old man now, and there's a good deal I've let myself forget on purpose. But not that. I keep the ledger. I keep the count. 9 children came in on Prout's wagon under a coal-smelling canvas. 8 were chosen quick, for their strong hands and their useful ages and the work they could do. 1 was passed over, the last one left. Worth nothing, we all decided without a word. She was worth the whole of it. She was worth a man walking down out of the snow. She was worth the only true speech I ever made. She was worth a fortune turned away at a kitchen table and a question asked of a child who'd earned the right to answer it.